I'm Michael Symons, grandson of the founder of St. Michael's.
I'm Rob Wilson, and I have been part of the community here, St. Michael's University School, going back to 1958.
My name is Peter Gardiner, and I came to university school in 1968.
I am Andrew Timmis. I am a graduate of university school. The graduation year 1965. I arrived at university school to live here for 23 years, starting at the end of August 1948. I was 11 months of age.
I started St. Michael's in September of 1952 until June of 1959. And I had the choice of either Oak Bay High School or university school, and I came up here from 1959 to 1963.
1958 to 1965 was my first job at University School, Victoria, BC. And the rest is history. 1974 to my retirement in 1999, spent here at St. Michael's University School, followed by my retirement, which then brought me into the school archives.
Headmaster Scarrett had been on his way to the printers with the Black and Red magazine when he collapsed on the sidewalk and died of a heart attack. And the Board of Governors of University School called my father and asked him if he would immediately take over the running of this school. So we arrived here to live in the headmaster's house at the end of August, and we lived here till the end of July 1970.
I didn't actually apply for a job at the school. It was all serendipity. I arrived in August. Beautiful day, much like today. Drove along McRae, and of course the school sitting in its grounds looked magnificent. My study bedroom was under the bell tower, a bell which rung to wake the students. The staff room, a haze of smoke, and be careful whose chair you're sitting in. Students fell into two categories: potential criminals and potential Nobel Prize winners.
My name is Michael Nation. I entered the school as a boy of 7 or 8 years of age in grade 3, and I went right through the school the 7 years that I was there, grades 3 to 9, graduating in June of 1967. My father attended St. Michael's in the late 20s and the early 30s, and his elder brother went through St. Michael's 3 years before him. My father, since he was an old boy and since he lived in Oak Bay all his life, he was drafted onto the board and was a board member for a very long time, mostly as the treasurer because he was a chartered accountant, but around the time of amalgamation, he was the chairman. More latterly, I've returned to the school in a sense. For the last 5 or 6 years, I have found it very, very fulfilling to volunteer in the archives. So that's my connection with the school.
The school had been a very close part of my life. I mean, it was near and dear to me. We started to look over photographs, and from the photographs we realized that a lot of them were not labeled, a lot of them didn't have any year on them. In fact, the same thing also occurred with St. Michael's, and that comes later. But basically, that's what started me in archives, was that the school history was a little bit ragged, and it so happened that the photographs in this case were in the library, and started to look at these photos, label them, and the next thing you knew, we were on our way to forming the archives. So it was the sort of an ignition of the beginning of our archives.
I think the archives are critical, particularly for St. Michael's Old Boys. We use the term now alumni, alumna, alumnus, but for us in that era, it was always an old boy, so that's the term I tend to use. Every university school old boy and SMU alumnus and alumna identify with this beautiful Mount Tommy campus. St. Michael's School old boys don't. And therefore, the archives are the most important for them because it's the location where all the memories and connections they have with the school are kept. Photographs like that are wonderful, but if they don't have any names attached to them, they are just history pieces, and the place for them is in a museum. The job of an archives, in which St. Michael's Archives or the job that it's doing, is putting the names to those photographs, and that makes the connection to the school living. It's a living connection that's maintained. It's not just a museum piece. So particularly for St. Michael's, it's critical, and in our job now at the archives is trying gradually to disinter all the wonderful stories that are buried there.
The Kerr Cup is the most prestigious cup given the school to the top person in grade 12. And it's a keeper. And because it's a keeper, we've got about 3 of them which have been given back to the school. So we have in archives 3 Kerr Cups, I think. And we have the original, which was 1923, awarded to Fred Pollard. W.W. Bolton, one of the founders of University School, was an excellent athlete. He was a 3A athlete in England and Cambridge Blue in athletics. And we've got 2 or 3 of his cups, his track cups. And if I recall, I think one of them's dated 1877, handsome cup. So there are a couple of Bolton cups, his personal cups. We have memorabilia, documents, which pertain to the presence of our founders, Barnacle, Bolton, Harvey for University School, and there's a lot of Symons family memorabilia pertaining to St. Michael's School.
The roll books of the old years, of the entire school, but particularly for the old years, are really fascinating because they include all the marks as well as the attendance. So there's lots of information there in between the lines, lots of other records which hold communications with the old boys. But from time to time, there are some really memorable discoveries, one of which is the subject of this article, which is a stuffed cougar's head from 1916, and it is featured as one of the main characters in this story in the school ties, so I encourage people to read that. And I hope that through telling the stories of the archives, which create not an intellectual connection with the school, but the visceral one that we love to feel, that we can draw some of those old contemporaries of mine and who were at the school during my era back to the school, to know that not only was the school part of their life, but in fact the opposite is true as well. It works the other way, that the school feels that the boys were part of its family and its life, and it just loves to have them come back. I have, for most of the time I've been there, I have been working on this series of photographs to name as many boys as I can, going back from my years in the 60s, right through going backwards to the 1920s and 1910s when it started. That's almost finished, and we have very, very high, through the help of several old boys who've come in and spent a good deal of time adding the names from their era. I've been trying to fill in all the gaps, and that's a very enriching experience for me and I think for the school. But there are hundreds of stories to uncover, disinter, that are lying there. And I would very much love to dig into them, to meet old boys who would be willing to talk about their memories, their time at the school, their impressions after so many years, so that we have them to bind us together. And so that's what I'd like to work on next. In December of 1958, during a fire inspection, the fire marshals condemned the school outright.
That's a sad story. The fire marshal would come down and do a unrehearsed, unannounced fire drill. And we got every student out of that school in less than a minute, out to the far side of Roslyn Road. And the whole school was wood. And the fire marshal sat down with my dad and my Uncle Carl and said, I really hate to do this, but this school is a fire trap. Yes, you can get the children out when there isn't a fire, but when there's a fire, there'll be panic. And we're going to have to close you, but you can finish this school year.
But with the condition that the classes and the activities were all assigned to the first floor and no one could go onto the second floor. So that brought on the crisis where they had to decide, would the school close or would it continue?
We had no land, we had no money, because all the money that was, at that point, it was still family owned. It was owned by my granddad, my dad, and my uncle. And every penny that came in went into keeping the school up. So I don't know how Mom and Dad did it, or Uncle Carl and Auntie Joan did it, but we had no funds. We couldn't, because the family had no way to rebuild. And a group of old boys came to them when they heard and said, this school is not dying. And they proposed a board of governors that would take over, get the land and build the school. But they said, we want the students to help and we need the families to help of the teachers. We had to vacate it. It was really sad. Uncle Carl and Dad, I remember they were in tears. And it's hard to, for a 14-year-old to see your dad and your uncle crying. And at that point, I didn't know what they were crying about. And I was concerned that Auntie Joan or Grandpa or, somebody had passed away, and that it was the school that they were concerned about. And so the Board of Governors stepped up, and we started fundraising. All the students did everything we could. We got our families involved. And when we finished, other than we had a couple of extra donations, and the new school was paid for. One of the Board of Governors, a gentleman by the name of Derek Todd, he said he would look after finding land for us. So he went to the person he found out who owned the little field, and went to a lady by her actual title name was Princess Chickmatoff, convinced her that it would be a good thing. She said certainly. They sat down and on a handshake settled for a price for the field. Derek pulled out a checkbook and wrote a check right there, and we had the field. We had an architect step up to do the design. I know that when we were getting close to the finishing of construction, Derek would have tea with Princess Chickmatoff at the Empress Hotel once every 2 weeks to keep her informed on the progress. And near the end, she came and says, well, is there anything else I can do for you? And Derek, with a smile on his face, said, yes, you could give me back my check. She opened her purse and produced the check and ripped it up. She'd never cashed it. And that was a gift from her. And her name, as everyone would know, is Jenny Butchart. And her boys had been to the school. Her nephew had been to the school. So she had a vested interest in the school in those days. So that's how St. Michael's managed to get that piece of property.
And within 9 months, They had built an entirely new school, for me, the new school, but what we know now as the junior campus on Victoria Avenue. And in 9 months, it was through an almost miraculous effort by the Symons family, the masters and the boys, but particularly old boys and parents. An entirely new school was ready for welcoming the students at the next school year, September 1959.
Boarding was carried out in dormitories, and compared to the residences which we have now, which, two people share a room, I always had one word for dormitories, the description of dormitories, and that word is Spartan.
The living conditions for students were, if you think about MASH, it's probably fairly close, except it's indoors. There were bunk beds, 8 to 10, depending on the grade, and smoking was banned at the school. There was no smoking. So that provided difficulties for the students to get their fix, I suppose.
The Spartan conditions bring people together. So, and I'm sure that boarding students raised under those conditions, developed lifelong friendships from it. And again, within a dormitory, and particularly in this school, were people from many parts of Canada, and we had a large American contingent, particularly from Seattle. And therefore, the congeniality which developed from these Spartan conditions, in many cases, turned out very well.
Dad would go around saying goodnight to every dormitory as lights out time came. And we had a little middle dormitory. It was a 4-bed dormitory. It was on the back side facing the lane. And there was just a wooden fire escape, a ladder attached to the house. And if the wind, you had to open the window and go down that if there was a fire. But Dad noticed a piece of string hanging down from the window. And he looked and he said, well, that's going out the window. So after he'd done lights out, he went to the back lane and he looked up, and behind the fire escape was a brown paper bag attached to this string. So Dad went up the fire escape, took the bag off, looked in it. It was candy and goodies. So Dad took the bag downstairs, weighed what was in it, and filled it with pebbles. Put it back in the bag where it was, and then Mom and Dad sat with the living room door, which was right opposite. You could see into the dormitory out the living room door. The door was open just a crack. And a little while later, he heard in a very typical schoolboy whisper, "Do you think it's time yet?" "No, it's too early." "Do you think it's time now?" "No, wait a few minutes." "Shh." There was quiet, and then "Do you think it's time?" "Yeah, he won't know now." And you could hear the boy stand up on his bed, because they were all the old army cots with the springs that squeaked. And he said, "It's still there, it's still there." And he pulled this thing up, and they all got on one bed, and they opened the bag, and all you heard, "The bastard, he found it." So Dad went up and explained that the food was on the kitchen table and they could retrieve it in the morning. And I'll never forget that, because those kids were so sure they'd pulled one over on Dad. And after that, they said, "Never try anything on Mr. Symons. You just won't fool him."
I went into a dorm on the main floor of what was Harvey House, and a young lad was sitting there, senior student, and I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just thinking about things and how they go and so on." And I thought, this smells very fishy to me. So I went and sat down beside him. And then I realized there was smoke between us. And I said, "Pat, have you been smoking?" "Yes, sir." "Where are those cigarettes now?" Upon which point the mattress burst into flame. And the practice was that they would slit open the mattress and keep their cigarettes in there. Unfortunately, the one he'd put in there was still alight. Window up, mattress out, onto the quad. Interestingly, that young man went on to be head boy.
There's many stories about the chapel, one of which can be found if you take a walk up to St. Luke's Church on Cedar Hill Crossroad. And if you walk around to the back, first of all, you'll see that the shape of St. Luke's Church is a long rectangle, and then there's a large addition on the east end of the building. And if you go around to the far side, on the north side, there's a stained glass window of a university school boy kneeling at the altar. The photograph of that stained glass window is displayed on the school's website. And that schoolboy is me. And I'm about 12 to 13 years old, and I'm dressed in that photograph exactly as I'm dressed today. But I was asked to go up there and be the model for the photograph for that stained glass window, which was installed there after St. Luke's Church enlarged their church to accommodate all the university school boys. Since the early days of university school, the boys of this school would march every Sunday morning. They were cadets, and everywhere they went, they would march in formation in platoons, and they'd march to St. Luke's Church for Sunday service. After the school population grew and grew and grew even more, a fundraising drive was started to build our own chapel right here. And since funds were limited, the boys themselves raised funds. There was a raffle. A boy named Ed Tate won the raffle for selling the most tickets. He was pretty smart. He was about 14 years of age, and he went down to the dockyard where his father worked, and he went in amongst all the employees, hundreds of employees at the dockyard, and must have sold a ticket to nearly every one. So he got a gold watch in front of the whole school for selling the most tickets. But we, the boys, raised the money from parents, friends, and others. And then we, the boys, built the chapel under the supervision of one journeyman carpenter, Mr. Logan. And I'm one of those who heaved beams and plywood and hammered nails. And we did it. Well, there were new buildings constructed during the 1950s and the 1960s. The first significant building constructed on this campus since the original buildings were constructed in 1908, 1909, was Brown Hall in 1958. And for the first time since 1908, the boys of the school were able to eat in a really nice dining hall, as opposed to the shacks, the wooden shacks they'd been dining in since pre-World War I days. At the opening ceremony, a photograph of which can be found in the Black and Red magazine for June 1958, the headmaster announced that for the first time in the school's history, all the debts had been paid off, the mortgage had been paid off, and the school was completely, for the first time since 1908, debt-free. That was a significant achievement. The Browns had their main home in Qualicum Beach, and Bob Brown had been a very highly regarded member of the school community here when he was here. I think he graduated in 1932. So Bob Brown was very keen to help the school, and my father encouraged him to make an amazing donation in his mother's name and to put up the funds to build Brown Hall. My mother worked on a collaborative effort with the architect Pat Burley. And Pat Burley was the father of Rob Wilson's wife, Pam. So Pat Burley, the architect, Wade Stockdale Burley, and my mother designed Brown Hall. My mother was a conceptual designer, and Pat Wade, the architect, was the formal designer. He put her conceptual plans into formal working drawings. And the design was inspired by Queen Elizabeth I's home, Hatfield House in England. And so the floor, which has been since covered with many other floors and hopefully one day will be restored to its original splendor, the beams, the chandeliers, the fireplace, the windows were all inspired by the designs of the Great Hall And so today many of us call Brown Hall the Great Hall. We're hoping one day it can be restored to once again become a great hall.
For the most part, it's what one would expect at the archives. But from time to time, there are some really memorable discoveries. A year ago, another extraordinary coincidence happened. I come up once or twice a week, so I came up on one of my visits, and as I walked in, I noticed on a table 2 silver cups or trophies, obviously some of the old sports trophies that hadn't been there the week before. And I asked Rob Wilson, who is the father of the archives, I asked him, well, what's the story with those cups? And he told me that they had just been turned in by the owner of a second-hand store in Sydney. They were really beaten up. One of them had its 2 handles had been struck off and was missing. But he recognized them as coming from St. Michael's, so he very kindly turned them into the school. The reason my memory bells began to ring is that I recognized one of the cups as being the Russell Maddock Cup for the half mile. Russell Maddock was an old boy of St. Michael's, 9 or 10 years ahead of me, who had been accidentally killed when he was a very young man, and the cup was donated in his name. And the reason that I recognized that cup is that it was presented to me as the first winner in 1966. And the other cup also was an intermediate sports cup, and my name was on it too. So these extraordinary things can happen when things come home to the school. Now, they're not always going to be that coincidental, and I'm not going to be the person there that is connected with it. But that's some of the extraordinary things that an archive can hold. And they are sort of walking stories that make their way through this city, and one hopes that they come back and find a home back at the school.
Very simply put, I'm a St. Michael's old boy and I'm a university school old boy. That was my connection. I came here, this was my school. The fact that, yes, it was bigger here, it was run a little differently, it still had the same regimen of an English private school. That is what I was brought up in. So changing schools, it was just a little bit different procedure. At St. Michael's, we had our own classroom and teachers came to us. Here, you had to go to the classroom where the teacher was. That was the biggest difference.
Amalgamation was obviously a very large event for the school, huge event and a milestone in its history. I was no longer at the school at that time, but my father was on the board. One day when he was at his office in downtown Victoria, he was visited by Claire Copeland, who was on the board of University School at the time. And Claire Copeland came to see him because he wanted to float the idea of a merger between the 2 schools. He thought it was a good idea and immediately called for an extraordinary meeting of the St. Michael's board. That happened within a couple of days.
I think it was a bit of a shock. The school was in serious trouble financially, and the facilities I would describe as shabby, worn. But there was a great spirit in the school.
It was at that meeting that the board decided that it was a good idea. And really it was a kind of perfect supply and demand situation. University School was land rich on this wonderful campus here, but very cash poor. And in contrast, St. Michael's was land poor because it was on a double lot stretching between Victoria Avenue at the front and Falkland Avenue at the back, and it was hemmed in by residences, houses on either side, and had no room to expand. But it was, if not cash rich, it was at least solidly solvent with lots of fundraising momentum in place. But because of that dynamic and the sort of vision, I guess, and the faith of the St. Michael's board members, they immediately agreed. They canvassed the parents and the old boys, the St. Michael's School family, who also agreed to the proposition, and so the decision was made formal. But that then only set in train the very sort of delicate navigational journey of merging the two schools. So for example, what do you call the school? What do you do with the crests and the school colors? Who would be the headmaster of the combined school, and how would the board be constituted? So for example, the name of the school, would it be University School because it was the secondary school and not the preparatory school? Would it be just St. Michael's School because St. Michael's was the stronger position? Would it be a brand new name, or would it be a combined name? So obviously we know that the name was combined, and partly I think due to the sort of rhythm of the name, but also partly because St. Michael's definitely was in the driving seat at that point. It was called St. Michael's University School. But somebody objected to the fact that it sounded like a possessive. St. Michael's School means the school of St. Michael's. There's an apostrophe there. And if it was St. Michael's apostrophe University School, it looked to some people like, well, University School is owned by St. Michael's and we don't want that. So some very practical-minded person just said, well, take the apostrophe out. There's no possession, it's just the name. And so that's what we see today. It's St. Michael's University School with no apostrophe. The crests are interesting. You can see behind me, there's the two crests. So do you have them side by side? Do you invent a new one? They wanted both to remind the new school family that it had these two heritages, these two histories. And they thought it was a good idea to sort of overlap them. But there are strict rules about that. They contacted the College of Heralds in Britain and asked them, what are the rules here? And behind heraldry, there's hundreds of years of tradition, and they're very distinct rules. And when you overlap two shields like that, St. Michael's again wanted, okay, well, we're the seniors, we're becoming the dominant school here. The overlap, our shield should be, or our crest should be on top. And the College of Heralds said, no, 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 no. University School is the senior school, meaning not by grade structure, but in age. It was 2 years older than St. Michael's, so by the laws of heraldry, its corner had to be on top. And so that's what you'll see in those old photographs of that combined crest. When they combined it, St. Michael's stipulated that it would have one more board member than the number of university school board members. And it was agreed to both sides very happily, was that the chairman of St. Michael's would become the chair of the merged, united board. That man's name was John Nation.
Peter Caleb was the head of St. Michael's School and became the head of the amalgamated school, St. Michael's University School. A daunting task. Post-Vietnam, trying to get boarding students, it was very difficult. And Peter had to go out to Asia, to Hong Kong, and to Mexico in order to gain enrollment for boarding, for which again he was criticized for having too many students from Asia and from Mexico. They were a very loyal group, and in fact, one of them was Cliff's son, and here we are. The Sun Center. How amazing, and we are so grateful, Cliff.
My thing today, when I talk to a St. Michael's boy, I say, you know what? My granddad would look down on this and say, how did my little school get to this? This is amazing. And I know that's how Dad felt, because he came up here after amalgamation. He was up here, he was doing admissions, and he was doing a bunch of stuff at the school here. He wouldn't have done that if he didn't believe in the amalgamation. And to me, we're losing out not making a bigger effort to reconnect with St. Michael's boys, because let's face it, there's not that much longer before there's not going to be St. Michael's old boys, and there's not going to be University School old boys. And they're part of the richness of the history, and we need to get that from both lots. This is St. Michael's, this is University School, but the name is now St. Michael's University School. It's still our school.
It was just, I was happy here. It was sort of a normal experience. I liked the boundaries that it gave to me. They were good for me. I think that the masters were good, decent men, and that was reflected on the boys. So unusually, I think, I feel more allied, I feel a closer affinity to St. Michael's than I have felt to my high school and to my university. Usually it's the other way round. For me, my alliance, my affinity, my fondness has always been for St. Michael's.
I'm fortunately approaching my 87th birthday. It's recently dawned on me that my very good friends and golfing partners, and what I don't realize that I may be 87, but they're in their middle 70s. So, and I suppose we've sort of all grown up together in many ways. Yeah, they were students. It was a student teacher, but then we're now just sort of fellow hunters, fellow drinking partners, and while I'm in my 80s, well, they're in their 70s, so we're all senior citizens now.
It was a different life having your family teach you. You're in the classroom and you have to call your dad sir. And I can very vividly remember one day in Canadian history in grade 4, I knew the answer to a question, and we all put our hands up, and he was asking, and every boy was getting it wrong. And I got to the point I was holding my elbow because my arm was getting tired, and I was waving it, and I just got so frustrated. I stood up and said, "Dad, I know the answer." And Dad came down, and I had about a 3-minute lecture that I am dad at home, not during the school year, or if it's just you and your mom and I. The rest of the time, I am sir, and I will remain sir. I never called him dad again.
Well, we're all living in a different world. And there's different social standards, different social activity, different social attitudes. So the school has had to adapt to the modern world that it now operates in. And punishment is one thing. Punishments that were commonplace and normal 50 years ago are not even socially accepted today. We took it as normal. We had corporal punishment at this school. I don't think very many boys resent today what they had to endure. They might have resented it at the time. Discipline was always up front. It was always a very prominent thought on people's minds, whether it was on the minds of the student or on the minds of the staff, that boys needed discipline. And I believe that I benefited from good discipline, whether it was a punishment discipline or whether it was just simply being taught in school, either in the classroom or on the rugby field, to stay the course, to finish the job, to never give up, to demonstrate determination. Those disciplines, separate and apart from any punishment discipline, were very important.
I was a very excitable, sort of violently energetic boy. And so the uniform, the more strict discipline than in the public schools, the rules really suited me. And I loved the subjects. We started French in grade 3, Latin in grade 4, algebra in grade 5, and geometry in grade 6. We had Canadian and British history, and we had a lot of English grammar. I see some of my friends from my year occasionally for coffee, and it's actually becoming more often now, more common for us to have coffee. And I've gotten to the stage in my life where I've realized that, wow, that guy has known me for 55 or 60 years now. And even though I might not have been that close to them in the intervening 50 years, I think we feel, or at least I feel, that it is a really great value and an addition to my life to have those people in my life. So I do try to see them. It wasn't a perfect school, and neither were certainly I wasn't, and neither were the boys. But what I'm left with, what I walked away with was, I liked that school. It was very good for me. And I think perhaps most of the old boys of St. Michael's would say something similar to that. It was part of their constitution of the men they grew into.
History is a subject I have been interested in all my life. I have regarded always that the history of this school has been a fabulous one, with its international participation and wide-reaching, wide-ranging presence on the world scene. And I feel that wonderful international history is an asset, and it's a tool that this school can use to its benefit in order to attract students and their families to want to come here in the future, to make people feel that they'd like to be a part of this scene that was so famous and so noteworthy for 100 years. And that if they learn more about the school's history, it will only increase their interest and their desire to come here. That prospective parents should know more about the history of this school, so they'll feel more inclined to enroll their students here. And that potential donors should know as much as can be shown to them about the school's history to make them more inclined to want to donate to something that's really special. Alumni feel, as the years go by, that their school is still up and running, even though on a daily basis it's a very different school.
I would just like to say, if the old boys who were at the school 50, 60, and there are some alive who were there 80 years ago at St. Michael's, could see the school now, they'd be absolutely astonished at the changes that are here. K to 12, boys and girls, 2 wonderful, highly functioning campuses, and an enormous array, variety of subjects taught and extracurricular activities offered. But at the same time, I think they'd feel that the current school family has every right to feel very proud of the school and what it has become.
Each of us experienced our own first day at this institution. We may not have noticed that the school itself was moving along a path when we started, but hopefully that's clearer now. And we, those who are here today, we guide the direction in which we're traveling every day, for better or for worse. Others brought St. Michael's University School this far. As Mr. Turner suggested at the opening, it's our turn to leave this place better than we found it. Consider it a challenge that was laid down by those who have gone before us. Vivat!
you.